Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on the planet. Thank you for joining us. And if you're watching this on demand, it could be any time of the day. But thank you for joining us on this webinar today. Um, this is a very interesting topic, right? And one that people have talked a lot about for a long time. And I would argue that cyber war has not quite turned out like a lot of people thought it would. But it is definitely something that is occurring. And the conflicts that we see between countries, between different groups, is definitely playing out in cyberspace. Whether you're talking information operations or critical infrastructure disruption, cyberspace is both a battlefield and a medium for that conflict. But unlike in other domains, the private sector has a much larger role in cyberspace than just supplying the weaponry that militaries use. They're actively defending against attacks, they're collecting intelligence, they're providing services, and they're often located in countries not directly involved in the conflict. And so, therefore, the role of the private sector in those conflicts is very different than that are, if they're involved in cybersecurity, it's very different than in a lot of previous conflicts or for a lot of other organizations. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, and certainly one of those aspects. And we're going to talk about how it has played out in one particular conflict, that the Russia-Ukraine war. So to introduce myself, I am Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. We are a nonprofit threat intelligence sharing organization based in the United States, but we have global membership. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves as I turn to them each with their first question, just to, so the audience knows a little bit about your background and where you're coming from. Greg, I'm going to start with you. What is the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative, and how did it get started, and what is its relevance to this discussion that we're having?
Thanks, Michael, and appreciate your and CTA's association with the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative. By background, I was a military officer in the U.S. Air Force for 27 years and served the second half of that career working on the origins of cybersecurity for the U.S. government and military. I had the opportunity to serve on the National Security Council staff and was the operations group commander for the Air Force's Information Warfare Center. So I have a pretty strong sense of how this plays out and the potential in conflicts, and have run operations. That was quite a long time ago that I did those things. And subsequently have run two consulting groups, including the one Next Peak that I currently run, but served in the between those as the chief or the chief information security officer globally for JP Morgan Chase. So actually coordinated closely with Michael when Michael was in the White House about the financial services sector. So I say all that as I think I bring a perspective both from a governmental side about cyber conflict, but also from the private sector side affected by these conflicts, and then potentially being engaged to help defend those aggressed in these conflicts. I had the opportunity to go to Kyiv and work with the Ukrainians before the Russian reinvasion in 2022. I went in 2020 and had done work with the National Security and Defense Council. And when the re-invasion occurred, I picked up the phone is sort of the easiest way to and called the people I was collaborating with on the NSDC and then soon a Ukrainian organization named GC3, and then friends in U.S. cyber industry, and including some of the companies on the phone or on the line, and Martin in particular, and Palo Alto, but through Michael and through leaders such as Art Coviello and Kevin Mandia and Amit Uran, and asked if they would volunteer assistance if we could figure out what Ukrainian requirements were. So everybody immediately said yes. This was very much a ad hoc pickup game. If you're interested in the story, there's an interesting podcast by Dina Temple-Raston called Forming a Cyber Posse for the Ukraine, which tells that story pretty well from a number of perspectives. And, we worked to try to get requirements out of the Ukraine from a variety of different sources. And Olesya, that'll be interesting to talk about the evolution into, the Talon mechanism and tempo and how that works now. But, from 22 forward, we've been trying to match the participant companies in the Cyber Defense Assistance Collective with requirements from both governmental and private sector organizations, have extended the organization to a lot of information sharing, I would call it, or situational awareness with governments. The U.S. government, in particular, very early on validated moving forward with this activity. But we collaborate with the European governments quite a bit, and actually the Japanese are involved both as companies and as a government. And try to advocate for the importance of both private sector participation appropriately in these conflicts, as well as the particular need to provide cyber defense assistance to the Ukraine. Continues to this day. Michael, I'll stop there. We can get into more details, as useful.
Sure. I mean, I think it's interesting that you talk about it starting as a pickup game, because that's exactly what it started as, right? Greg called everybody that he knew, and people showed up, and there was no actual organization, right? There were no team uniforms. There were no, it was just, somebody brought the ball, and we started working with that. So it's an interesting, and it was very interesting too to me about sort of why companies chose to engage or not engage in that effort. So Martin, why don't I turn to you and get your perspective on why did Palo Alto Networks decide to get involved with CDAC, and why are you still supporting it? And don't forget to introduce yourself.
Yeah, no, I won't. So thanks, Michael, and thanks to CDA for inviting us to sort of join this discussion. So I'll caveat what everything I'm saying is part of the work we've been doing as Palo Alto Networks, but mostly Unit 42 that have been sort of on the front lines for our company. But myself, I'm Martijn Nuijten. I head up global policy and cyber partnerships at Palo Alto Networks, based here in Washington, D.C. My job really is to help governments sort of navigate and understand sort of the emerging threats in cyberspace, make sure that we as a company are well positioned to provide our expertise, and make sure we build those relationships and really make sure that we move the needle in the right direction. So I think that's sort of the role I have, and working closely with experts within the company, but also outside, of course, working with our industry peers, NGOs, academia, government agencies, obviously, to make sure that we are have our eye on the ball and make sure that we are ultimately, the core mission we have is to further help secure the global digital ecosystem. So that from that core missions perspective, especially when there are stakeholders and countries that are in immediate need of that type of assistance, for us it's sort of a straightforward question, like, yes, we want to step up and help out. And I think in that sense, we also felt with CDAC at the time, bringing together all the private sector players, even though it was ad hoc, we really felt like industry had that responsibility to work together and make sure that we help Ukraine in this case to field and defend itself against the Russian aggression in cyber, and to keep the lights on in Kyiv, so to speak. And I think that was for us not a very difficult question, and that's how we got involved. And I think with CDAC, providing that sort of coordination mechanism was very helpful for us to really, as a global company having global telemetry, it was really good to sort of compare notes with, if we have that visibility, we really have sort of a good first look at what the adversaries are potentially going to deploy. And that combining with, our peers in industry, we're really able to effectively detect some of the first waves of the destructive wipers that were aimed at Ukraine at the time in the early days, and really sort of help defend against those and take them out as needed. And I think that, was in large part also due to the fact that CDAC was able to sort of convene this group of private sector companies and get the ball rolling. And I think, why we're still, over the years, we've been providing indicators of compromise, thousands of them to, dozens of government entities in Ukraine, military organizations, and obviously critical infrastructure operators. And, for us, as I said, that's a no-brainer to do so, but we get also something in return that's super valuable, right? We get sort of the operational battlefield insights that then we in turn can help further enhance our own products and services to defend global customers against these types of campaigns as they're unfolding. So it's definitely been for us a very valuable partnership through CDAC and directly with the Ukrainians to really, ultimately help them defend against the Russian aggression in cyber, but also ultimately help ourselves and our customers globally. So we hope to continue that, and we're also looking forward to ultimately scale some of these lessons learned around the rest of the world. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. We will definitely come back to that because I think that there are many lessons that we should be taking from this war and applying them in some other places. I will say that it often struck me as the war kicked off that this was actually a pretty easy choice for a lot of people because the Russians were the clear aggressors. I mean, heck, you had a leader in Russia who, if you asked for a villain from central casting, you would come up with something like that. So it's, it made it much easier, I think, but it was still challenging, and there were a lot of issues around, how is this going to work? How do we understand what the Ukrainians actually want? How are we actually going to get the services there? All of those things have continued to evolve. And while the drone capabilities of Ukraine rightfully get a lot of attention, I would argue that we should also be paying attention to the lessons that have come out of the Ukrainian capabilities in cybersecurity and the processes that have been set up to connect the private sector with not just the Ukrainian government, but the private sector outside Ukraine with what's going on inside Ukraine. And so that's where I'm going to turn to Olesya to introduce herself and talk about how is Ukraine working with the private sector today. And in particular, some people may have heard the term Tallinn mechanism thrown around. So can you explain the Tallinn mechanism and how that works?
So first of all, let me express my gratitude for invitation today and to connect me with you as the same as Greg and you, Michael. I have a background in financial services, and sharing threat intelligence is the main idea I was promoting for so many years, and that is why all my activities are connected to development of public-private partnership in the area of cybercrime prevention and investigations, and that is why I happened to be selected as the head of Tallinn Mechanism Project Office a year ago. Tallinn Mechanism Project Office was established in April 2025 to manage all the processes on the Tallinn Mechanism framework here in Ukraine. So I am based in Kiev, and my team, Tallinn Mechanism Project Office, is also based in Kiev. But Tallinn Mechanism framework by itself, it was established in the end of 2023 as an answer to the demand to coordinate support of different countries for Ukraine for civilian cybersecurity. So Tallinn mechanism is initiative that supports only cybersecurity of civilian infrastructure. So we are working with ministries, local authorities. We are not able to support militaries due to policies of the countries that are members of Tallinn mechanism. And that means that, of course, we are completely not limited, but streamlined with Ukrainian legislation for such authorities, how they can manage the processes on cybersecurity and what support they can accept, because we know that there are a lot of private sector companies that would like to support Ukrainian civil infrastructure, but we need to act due to established procedures in Ukraine. This support will be legitimate. So that means that to implement something in Ukraine in cybersecurity, we need to pass this procedure that is called international technical assistance. And for this goal, Tallinn mechanism countries are working with implementing partners such as DAI, for example, such as CRDF. So it depends on the country whom what implementing partners they will select and who will implement their projects. In the same time, we receive a lot of direct requests from private sector companies how to join talent mechanism, how to work on the talent mechanism framework. And each time we need to explain that there are no opportunity to work on the talent mechanism besides established procedure of procurements that are organized by our implementing partners. So the only thing we can do together with private sector, as it was seemed to us a year ago, it was to publish all these procurements on the joint platform that is called Talent Mechanism Platform, to make them available for the companies that would like to support such projects. So we have launched Talent Mechanism Platform in the beginning of this year, and we encourage now private sector companies that would like to participate projects on the talent mechanism to register there, to receive notifications about procurements and open possibilities to participate in the projects. But since we have launched this platform, we have discovered that there are other opportunities out of our main idea that were opened for private sector, because for many countries it is a possibility to find local partners from Ukrainian cybersecurity companies. So they are using this list of trusted companies to search partners in Ukraine, to establish direct connections, to work with them directly. That's the first option. Another was that, for example, one of our country of talent mechanism established a new approach. They have created Ukrainian grant fund, and they have announced the possibility to create joint projects together with their companies and Ukrainian companies, and to create new products. So we see now the talent mechanism platform as a starting point for development of cooperation between private companies in Ukraine and abroad, but it is not the final shape how it can look like. So we are now on the stage of shaping these opportunities, and that is why we are here, and that is why we are communicating with CDAC, because CDAC is coordinating exactly this support of private sector. And we, as a talent mechanism who is coordinating the support on the state level, need to find the proper formats of such cooperation that will be more effectively for both parties. Because, as was mentioned by Martin, it is really so. Supporting Ukraine, you also enrich your products by threat intelligence, and that's like win-win process. And we would like to work in this direction together, not to be the country that just receives support, but to share our experience, our expertise, our threat intelligence, to make all of us even stronger than we are when we are alone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olesya. There's a lot in there of what you said, right? And I completely agree, first and foremost, that anybody in our field who is not paying attention to what what you have managed to do in terms of cyber resilience is foolish, because there are enormous lessons to be learned from how effective not just the private sector, but the public sector in Ukraine has been at defending yourselves in cyberspace. The fact that there are not continuous news stories about outages due to cyber effects is actually part of that story. And it's something that Greg and I have talked a lot about and want to continue to draw from. But not only that, it's the organizational level, right? You created mechanisms to get money from governments into, to the private sector, from third parties, to fund stuff in Ukraine. And that's complicated. That's not an easy thing to do. There are organizations that help specialize in some of this. That's why we're going to turn to Doug now. So first of all, Doug, you could go ahead and introduce yourself, but also what role does DAI play in this? Oh, and by the way, define that acronym. Even for the acronym-laden Washington listeners, they may not know that one. So.
Thank you, Michael. It's an absolute pleasure to join the discussion. And again, thanks to CTA for organizing this. My name is Douglas White. I go by Doug. I am currently the Chief of Party for the U.S. Cybersecurity for Critical Infrastructure Ukraine activity. This originally was started as a U.S. Agency for International Development project, which began in 2020. I joined it in 2021. Long story short, it was rolled into the State Department, and now is the project has been continued for another 3 years, and it is managed by the State Department rather than USAID, which I believe the last I heard is sunsetting officially at the end of this fiscal year. So DAI, honestly, it just goes by the letters anymore. Back in the day, it used to stand for Development Alternatives Incorporated. And it's just been DAI for as long as I've been here. So we are basically an integrating contractor for the State Department in this space. As I say, I came to the project in 2021 as technical director, and then was asked in February of this year to step into the chief of party role. Prior to 2021, I was working with an implementer that Olesya mentioned, CRDF Global. So I started their operations, their cyber operations, supporting government of Ukraine here in Ukraine back in 2017, 2018. CRDF was for many years well known for implementing international collaboration projects for the Department of State's Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, as well as exports, EXPIS's export control and border security related programming, as well as I think INL, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. And they do that globally, not just here in Ukraine. But back in 2017, some money shook loose in Washington through the Geographic Bureau, EUR, and they were looking for concepts and ideas for how to program to that. So the State Department took some white papers from CRDF, which my team and I put together, and we initially started with sort of some general capacity building on the workforce development side, developing new coursework and curriculum across, I think it was initially 5 higher educational institutions here in Ukraine. We did a lot of procurement. We did a broad cyber awareness campaign, which eventually went nationwide. So I can't say enough positive things about CRDF Global. It's been a pleasure it was always a pleasure to work there, and it's been a great source of pride to see how they've grown. Very big team in Ukraine, and they're doing excellent work here. Over on the DAI side, what we have been focused on since 2020 is basically 3 areas. One we call sort of the enabling environment, and that is everywhere from working with the government of Ukraine to create some of the legislation which is necessary to modernize for digital transformation and to enable effective cybersecurity resilience across government. We do workforce development initiatives as well, including most recently, we developed an industrial control systems lab at Kyiv Polytech Institute. We've worked with about 28 higher educational institutions across Ukraine, and we work with the State Service for Special Communication and Information Protection, the SSSCIP, through their qualification centers and their educational and specialization sort of training programs. And we work closely with the Ministry of Digital Transformation as well. There's a very close tie-in between what my project does, or the short form for U.S. Cybersecurity for Critical Infrastructure Ukraine is CCI. So with CCI, how we relate to the Talent Mechanism and the Talent Mechanism Project Office. About 3 years ago, we met some of the principals in The Hague who were pulling together kind of the initial concepts for the Talent Mechanism. And at that time, we had just launched a line of efforts, what we call the CCIPAs, the Critical Infrastructure Cyber Incident Preparedness Assessments, which is basically, it's akin to a SOC 2. It's basically a long, detailed look at sort of, I think it's 134 different controls. It's informed by the NIST cybersecurity framework. And then we provide a scorecard and sort of score on a maturity matrix. We've performed this for about 190 something different enterprises, sort of a combination of critical infrastructure operators here in Ukraine, which are primarily state-owned enterprises, as well as government agencies who are particularly important to continuity of government and digital services. And those reports came with recommendations and frequently a snapshot for some of the more advanced kind of network operators, what solution they sort of need, sort of a snapshot of the architecture, the data flows, how it integrates with the legacy environments, and sort of a rough order of magnitude budget and a bill of materials. And so those 90-something projects then formed the sort of initial tranche of what is currently in, or some of them have thankfully been cycled out and funded in the Tallinn mechanism catalog. So we sort of helped initially by default, creating a little bit of structure in sort of systematizing what the Ukrainian government was asking for. It was a very challenging problem in 22 when this first began, because, and even earlier, we would sort of get what we called the Amazon wish list from the Ukrainian government entities. And they sort of had a long list of hardware and software that they wanted, but it was very hard to sell the picture to the foreign donors to say, well, what problem is this solving? Because what we see here is a list of components. How's this going to work? What's it going to do? What kind of impact and results can the foreign donor expect from purchasing this and implementing it through agencies like USAID, like State Department, and like their implementers? So it's been a pretty fruitful conversation so far with the Tallinn mechanism folks. I had the pleasure of meeting Olesya a couple times here in Kyiv, most recently together with my team. And I can tell you that she is very much like a duck, very cool on the surface, but underneath there is a fury of activity going on, because the Tallinn mechanism, as you pointed out, Michael, is a very, very complicated environment. I think you've got 14 different governments, so that's 14 different ministries of foreign affairs. I don't know how many agencies on the Ukrainian side are actually involved with projects that they have put into the Tallinn mechanism. Then you've got a whole ecosystem of SIs here, the systems integrators that are here, the US principals and the OEMs. It's an incredibly complex environment. And particularly after that meeting my team and I had with Olesya a couple of weeks ago, my hat is off. And I don't know how you do it with so few people, Olesya.
Well, thanks, Doug. I think, again, this is an interesting area to me. And I want to talk about one thing, Greg, and maybe this is something you and I have talked about before, but why does the private sector have such an outsized role in this space? Like, why all of this sort of toing and froing going on here?
I guess, to remind everybody, fundamentally, the technology of the digital environment is, generated by the private sector, right? Even governments use, commercial software, hardware, protocols that are developed through coordination and, through private sector organizations, like ISO and ICANN and those sorts of things. So like, the knowledge of how the environment where conflict or disruption can occur is fundamentally in the private sector. So the increasingly now the actual products and services that secure that environment are also coming from the private sector. I had a background in the 90s and the knots where I grew up in the military, and a lot of the expertise about how to defend an attack was resident in governmental organizations, but that has dramatically changed over the last 2 decades. So, there's even the US government doesn't defend itself by creating its own defensive, products and services anymore, though, I mean, services to a degree, but, the technology is sourced from the private sector as well. So, it is very different than traditional national security. And this is, going to be ever more we're already deeply in it, where, you've got a conflict environment where the landscape is produced by the private sector. Most of the capabilities technologically are in the private sector, and even the operational acumen is in the private sector, right? So, marshaling all that to sustain, and I'm just going to reinforce the note deeply that Michael, made about if you're going to operate a nation under attack, you're going to essentially be working, from an environment in the private sector made, and you need to collaborate with the private sector to sustain that for your government essential services, your critical infrastructure services. I think deeply for this audience, one of the opportunities is to learn the lessons of digital resilience that the Ukrainians have demonstrated for us, and to do that in a very structured way. As a person who's got 30 years of the evolution of conflict and the ability to defend enterprises all the way up to JP Morgan, those lessons could be effectively in the hands of everybody in the globe. I go to Tokyo on Sunday, and they are hungry for these lessons too there because of the risks they have of disruption and loss of critical information. So, a call out to the way forward being continue to help the Ukrainians be digitally resilient, but learn from them deeply, just like we learned from Estonians lessons about cyber defense that started in 2007.
Yeah, and I think we're going to come back to some of those lessons, Greg, in just a minute. I want to just sort of, open it up to anyone to reflect on this question. Olesya mentioned some of the issues that, the Ukrainian government has faced. Martin has touched on, a few of the issues that companies have had to face, but maybe for Greg, you've faced this too, but for any of the panelists, what do you think some of the issues specifically that private sector companies will have to deal with in, conflict zones, not just this one, but sort of conflict in general? And what are the issues that governments have to wrestle with as they think about how to prepare for, other conflicts? Anybody that wants to sort of jump in on that?
Maybe I can jump in here a little. Yeah. So I think one of the challenges is not so much anymore that we are able to access the information. We have a lot of information. If we bring it all together through the right mechanisms, we have a lot of volume of data that we can analyze and work with. But the main question is more like, how do we really operationalize that intelligence quickly enough and it's fit for purpose and tactically relevant for whatever situation is arising? I think that sort of clearinghouse mechanism, because most of the operational threat intelligence sharing is based on very trusted personal relationships that exist between our researchers, between folks in Ukraine. And how do we sort of go from that way of collaborating to a little bit more in a way of professional, scalable setup where we are, more nimble in sort of getting the situational awareness picture more clear earlier, and then action that in a certain way that everybody can take advantage of that. So that is sort of one of the challenges we see, at least, sort of how do you further operationalize based on the lessons learned in Ukraine and going away from sort of somewhat fragmented way of sharing information to a more professional way of doing it as such. So I think that's one of them. And the other thing I'd like to sort of throw in here is the pace of innovation. Obviously, the Ukrainians are, have become a powerhouse of how they are innovating themselves, how they're using certain new technologies, drones in particular, in hybrid warfare. I think also on the cybersecurity industry, especially now with the AI topic sort of, consuming all of us these days, especially with the frontier AI models like Anthropic's Mythos, and I'm pretty confident Anthropic is working with the Ukrainians. That in itself, the pace of innovation is another challenge. So how do we make sure that the success stories of how we're innovating in cyber and deploying that globally can also find its way to the folks who need it the most? So again, a little bit of a clearinghouse function where we bring all these success stories together and have the donors and the Ukrainians also better understand what is the state of the art these days and what is it that we really need currently, instead of maybe going back to some of the existing technologies that are out there because they're just familiar with working with those. So there's a lot of innovation out there. So that's another challenge. So how we bring that closer to the folks who need it So those are two areas where I think we can make some more progress.
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting point, and we've seen this over the evolution of CDAC, right? Which is one of the issues is how do you hit that right balance between you've got a set of people that are operating that are fighting a war, right? They're operating in a conflict, and so you want to give them what they need and what they want, and in some cases what they're used to, right? Because they don't have time to learn something new. Um, but on the other hand, sometimes there's better ways of doing things. There's more efficient, more effective ways, more effective products. And so you want to get them that too. And so trying to find that right balance um, is definitely very challenging. And we saw that over and over again through as CDAC has sort of gone on over the last few years. But I mean, Olesya, any sort of lessons that are issues rather that you have you've identified a few, but are there other issues that you think governments particularly have to think about as they are thinking about future conflict?
Actually, as talent mechanism is mainly working with donor support and this financial part of this story. We are not organizing these activities, and the main drivers in this area are our cybersecurity agencies, triple SCAP that was mentioned by Doug, National Cybersecurity Coordination Center, and they are part of these communities who are creating the formats of the threat sharing and determine the way how this would be more efficient and will have more practical uses for all of us. So from this perspective, we are just standing by this process, and in case if some support is needed for these agencies, we are working with donors to support them in if they require some additional tools, instruments, etc. But in the same time, currently, talent mechanism donors are raising more often the question that cooperation under talent mechanism framework should be not just on the financial questions, but also about this threat sharing and lessons learned from hybrid cyber war. And probably that will be a new track that will be added under the umbrella of talent mechanism framework, and that will be shaped under it. But currently it's like first signs of this, but there are no concrete steps that I can announce that something was already done. We see that this cooperation is leading by talent mechanism, under talent mechanism framework will finally lead all of us to this cooperation. But the shape of this cooperation, especially in the area where there are already a lot of good working examples of such threat sharing, and we just need to work with all of them and to take the best practices from all that is already existing. That is a reference to the Doug question, how it is possible to operate with 5 person in the team only. We are not trying to duplicate someone efforts that are already done. If something is working very well and the people has much more experience than we are, we just cooperate with them and create collaborations, but we are not trying to substitute them. That is why our small team is good enough for this task. So our task is coordination, and we see that there are a lot of requests on this coordination of threat sharing with Ukraine, and probably this also would be the task that will be dedicated to us as well. But we are not trying to be involved in this task because we have our cybersecurity agencies that are really experts in this, and we just may support you in coordination. And in case if you have any questions, you may contact us and we will connect you and find the best people, the best private companies that you may cooperate with. So it's our idea is to support you in this matchmaking, but not to duplicate and create a new something. We do not try to invent bicycle. We just try to move more effectively with those ones that was already invented.
Great.
I'd like to add to that if I can, Michael. I think there's a tremendous amount for governments to learn from this environment and the experience of Ukraine, as well as private sector. To harken back to one of your earlier points, I think one of the most important lessons is that cyber conflict didn't evolve as expected. A decade ago, we talked about cyber Pearl Harbor events, sort of something that would decisively kind of collapse nation states. Instead, what we have seen and what we continue to see here is a more persistent and strategically significant approach by the main adversary, which is continuous cyber operations integrated into broader hybrid warfare campaigns. So what has Russia been able to do here successfully? They've conducted cyber operations to disrupt civilian services, support military objectives, undermine public confidence, shape information campaigns and information environments, collect intelligence, obviously, but also pressure institutions, and generally speaking, impose sort of a cumulative set of economic and administrative costs on Ukraine over time. And so in this environment, the private sector has become operationally indispensable. The governments alone, they don't operate or own most of cyberspace. It's very much shared critical infrastructure where we're working, cloud environments, telecoms backbones, cybersecurity telemetry, IR capabilities, threat intelligence pipelines. A lot of this, most of this arguably, is in private hands. So what we've seen here in Ukraine is something I think historically significant and applicable to other theaters, be those conflict theaters or ones where conflict has not arrived. This emergence of a sort of a wartime model where governments, private sector, cybersecurity companies, cloud providers, telecoms, civil society, and international partners like the ones Olesya is representing, they all operate together here as part of a sort of a distributed cyber defense ecosystem. And I think the question that this environment answers is, can you continue operating during continuous disruption? So far, Ukraine has been able to answer that question positively. And it's a model that others should be looking very closely at.
Yeah, I think, and thanks for that. And I think, one of the fundamental issues that we have, I think, from the United States, from the West, is we have a very binary view of conflict. One is either at peace or one is at war. And the Russians and the Chinese don't think that way. Conflict is much more of a continuum, and it's a slider, and you sort of slide up and down the conflict scale, right? And that means that there is a lot of this, you mentioned the hybrid warfare, both of you mentioned the hybrid warfare that's going on, the combination of information operations, combining cyber with other things, makes for a much more complicated environment, much more complicated domain than just peace war, than that binary would lead you to believe. Greg, from your perspective, what are some of the other lessons that we've learned? And as we start to bring this webinar to a close, I'll sort of turn to everybody to think about, sort of where do we go from here? What are some of the lessons that we should take, and how should we, go forward and continue to evolve?
A lot come to mind. I'll try to get it down to two or three. We've published some lessons learned from, the CDAC experience in the Ukraine. So people can find those. There's a website, which is actually, I should mention, CDAC is housed inside organizationally CRDF Global, which is mentioned previously. So some of our lessons about the experience are available if people have a little bit of time to go look at a website. One that I would highlight is, as early as September 2022, I was asked, well, shouldn't we be doing this in Taiwan, or now increasingly the other near abroad of the Russians in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, Moldova, etc. I think many aspects of the model are applicable, right? In the sort of thing that I would stress that has been a struggle for the CDAC team is, Martin, called out the value of having a coordinating hub, but that hub is not resourced. It's actually at this stage all volunteer. The ability to do the coordination, I do and have been advocating for, could scale significantly the depth of the sharing, both of intelligence, but I think now importantly, lessons learned from, again, the win-win element of sharing what the Ukrainians have learned with the companies and the rest of the globe. These things take effort, right? And, we've been seeking and not been successful with, scaling the depth of our efforts, right? And if we're going to if the private sector, I think, needs these private sector-led hubs of coordination, but the private sector doesn't naturally convene the way we got lucky in some ways in the pickup game and got, sort of critical mass and has sustained it for 4 years. That's a pretty rare, maybe unique, development. We need to learn how to scale the ability to do that in many different situations, whether through CDAC and some, but whatever is appropriate for those situations.
Great. Others want to, chime in, sort of how should we think about this going forward? How do we think things should evolve?
If I may jump in again, I think for us, maybe everybody, the biggest lesson has been sort of the power of collaboration, right, and collective defense. I think that's so. How do we further scale that? And I think to Greg's point and Michael, yours as well. Like, I think one of the things where we can involve is to get private sector involved earlier on in planning, or when there's no conflict yet. It's not peace or war. We still have, like, take the Taiwan case, for example. There's already a lot of things we can start doing as private sector to think from a national security planning perspective, like bring us in, let's think through the use cases and issues that might arise when a conflict would happen. And what is it that we can always start implementing right now that really would raise their cyber posture overall and be better prepared for whatever might come. And I think that's, again, leveraging all the innovation that's happening already globally, the lessons learned from Ukraine. I think so figuring out a way, a mechanism or evolution where private sector gets a seat at the table earlier on somehow in this planning process and preparation is something that I think we can do a better job at this point. So I'll leave it at that.
Right.
Yeah, I'm very encouraged to hear those remarks, Martin. I think that's I think there's somewhere between a great opportunity and a great requirement for leadership from the private sector here. We talked about it that cyber resilience is by no means a government only function. This is very much an ecosystem function. Ukraine, I think, has the most operationally relevant environment in the world for understanding how governments and private sector can collaborate to kind of sustain national resilience. And I think that we shouldn't wait for government to lead the way. We shouldn't wait for NATO to lead the way. Everyone is struggling. These institutions that we built post-World War II, they struggle to figure out how to move quickly enough to adjust doctrine, to adjust to this new world of asymmetric players that have outside strategies and effects. And I think that the private sector really has an opportunity to step in here and lead the way, because I think that government is struggling. Government has a lot of institutions and institutional knowledge to bring to the table, but there's a real partnership opportunity. And I think that it's not easy to approach and work with government, but I think that the private sector really has an edge and an opportunity to lead the way here.
Great. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time to talk about this. This is an issue that I think is going to continue to evolve. We need to continue to learn the lessons that we can from the conflict and apply them into other spaces. I mean, the one that I always think of is that, we don't want to be exchanging business cards once the bullets start flying, right? We want to actually build a lot of these relationships sooner, before things get really hot. We should take the opportunity to, as Olesya mentioned, like getting the Talon mechanism up and running was a major endeavor that took several years, right? And if you actually had some of those in place before a hot conflict broke out, that would be, of immense value to the defenders, right? To be able to have that mechanism already built, even if there's not large dollars in there, having the structures already built, having those connections already made. I think those are some of the key lessons that I take from this situation, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you as we continue to evolve these efforts. And at some point, the war there will end, but there will be conflicts in other places, and we'll need to take those lessons and learnings and go forward. I will give this sort of a lightning round opportunity if there's any last things that our panelists want to add.
Appreciate the communities, coming together in that 22 moment in the, late winter, early spring. And for those companies that are engaged with CDAC, the 4 years of effort, this is like you said, Michael, this situation exists ever more, broadly across the globe. So hopefully we'll learn from it and be able to do as well or better in other places.
Yeah, I want to foot stomp that, Greg. It's when we were sitting on the outside back in DC watching what was happening here in February of 22, it was very frustrating to not be able to do more. And my project was effectively shut down. Everyone had left town. But watching you guys come together as CDAC and watching the private sector voluntarily come to the table with the assistance that they could, that was an important moment. And I can't say enough, I think, what that meant here for people on the ground in Ukraine. So hats off to you and hats off to everyone who contributed to CDAC then and continue to.
Thank you.
Great.
If I may to add a few words, I completely
Please.
support you, Michael, in your observations that private sector is the only one, and in my opinion, the most alive real force, real, alive, and that is called in terms of Machiavelli virtues. That is a force that cannot be stopped and that could be improved and improved on the real cases, because the private sector need to develop according to actual threats, and they are developing very quickly. So we are rely completely on private sector and their support in the development of talent mechanism. We are looking at them, we are learning from them, and we cannot overestimate it, the input they are bringing to cybersecurity, because they are the only one real driver force in this ecosystem. That's the first point. And the second, I would like to express gratitude to support of Ukraine for all this time. And I wish everyone to live in peaceful time, but actually to be ready to some cataclysms in cybersecurity area, because not be prepared doesn't mean that you will be like even if you do not believe that something will start, you have to be prepared. That's the point. Because
Absolutely.
we are not ostrich to hide our heads in the sand. Yes, it could
Oh,
be
you
very
have that saying as well. Yes. Okay, that's good to know. So yes, we definitely don't want to be ostriches. So yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And I am sure that we will continue this conversation in many different forms. And I will look forward to talking to all of you. So thank you very much.